The greatness of any human being does not begin in their bank account, their pedigree, or their circumstances, it begins in the quiet, unseen architecture of their thoughts. This is a simple, eternal truth, validated time and again by the trajectories of those we label as successful. Visionaries like Steve Jobs or Jeff Bezos did not simply build companies, they built physical manifestations of their internal landscapes. Long before them, Napoleon Hill wrote in his seminal work that you are the master of your destiny, capable of influencing, directing, and controlling your own environment. If this psychological premise holds true, that we ultimately become the physical embodiment of our most dominant thoughts, why do so many people spend decades trying to claw their way out of poverty, only to find themselves running endlessly on a treadmill of survival? Do they simply lack vision? Do they willingly choose to ignore their own boundless potential? The reality of poverty is that it is not merely a lack of finances, it is a pervasive mindset that actively rewires the brain. It narrows a person's focus exclusively to immediate survival, blinding them to the broader horizons of opportunity. This story could have unfolded in any sprawling metropolis, on a freezing subway platform in New York, a bustling square in London, or a chaotic railway terminal in Eastern Europe. It takes place in the spaces where thousands of people pass by one another every single day, their eyes glazed over, entirely disconnected from the shared humanity breathing just inches away from them. In the heart of a major transit hub, beneath towering vaulted ceilings of glass and wrought iron, lived a man named Elias. The station was a microcosm of the world, a ceaseless symphony of roaring engines, screeching brakes, automated announcements, and the rhythmic clicking of thousands of hurried footsteps. Elias was a permanent fixture in this transient world. For years, his days had blurred into a monotonous loop of gray survival. He sat on a piece of discarded cardboard near the southern exit, his hand outstretched, his voice reduced to a rehearsed, pathetic hum, asking for anything that could help him see another day. Elias shared his corner of the station with another homeless man named Silas. Silas was older, bitter, and entirely convinced that the world owed him a living because of the bad hand he had been dealt. Silas spent his days cursing the wealthy travelers who ignored him. Elias, on the other hand, didn't curse them, he simply believed he was fundamentally different from them. He had internalized his condition. He looked in the mirror of the station bathrooms and saw a void, a man who possessed absolutely nothing but a hollow, gnawing need to survive until tomorrow. One crisp autumn morning, a man strode through the southern exit who instantly caught Elias's eye. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal overcoat, carried a sleek leather briefcase, and moved with a quiet, undeniable authority. He didn't rush like the panicked commuters, he glided, grounded and secure. Elias immediately categorized him as a wealthy executive, a prime target for a generous donation. Mustering his most pitiful expression, Elias intercepted the man's path, holding out his battered paper cup and pleading that he had nothing and needed anything the man could spare. The executive stopped. He didn't look away in disgust, nor did he reach into his pocket with the detached pity Elias was accustomed to. Instead, he looked directly into Elias's eyes, holding his gaze with an intensity that made the beggar profoundly uncomfortable. The businessman asked, his voice calm and melodic, if Elias had ever considered offering something to these people, or if he had simply spent his life expecting them to hand him their hard-earned labor for free. Elias blinked, stunned, stammering that he had nothing to give, that he was merely a beggar. The businessman explained, devoid of arrogance but heavy with candor, that in life, and certainly in commerce, everything is built on the universal law of exchange. He told Elias that if he believed he had absolutely zero value to offer the world, he stripped himself of the right to ask the world for its resources, comparing it to asking for a harvest where no seeds had been planted. The businessman gave a polite nod, sidestepped the frozen beggar, and disappeared into the morning crowd. There was no cruelty in his delivery, but the words were brutally, agonizingly honest. They cut through years of Elias's conditioned victimhood like a scalpel. That night, the temperature dropped, and the station grew quiet, but Elias could not sleep. The businessman's words echoed relentlessly in his mind. The universal law of exchange. Elias looked at Silas, who was snoring loudly beneath a pile of damp blankets, having spent the evening complaining about how stingy the crowds had been. Elias realized that he had been playing the exact same game as Silas, just with less anger. He had been asking the world to value him, while he offered the world absolutely no value in return. But what could he possibly offer? He had no capital, no marketable skills, no inventory, and no home. 3 days later, while wandering the desolate tracks behind the station, Elias noticed a small patch of resilient wildflowers. They were bruised and dusty, fighting their way through the cracks in the unforgiving concrete. They were vibrant splashes of yellow and violet against an ocean of industrial gray. An idea, fragile but profound, took root in his mind. If he had no tangible goods to sell, he could at least offer a moment of beauty. He could offer a gesture of genuine gratitude. He carefully uprooted a few dozen of the strongest flowers, wiped the soot from their petals, and returned to his spot by the southern exit. When the rush hour began, a woman in a trench coat hastily tossed a silver coin into his cup, not even breaking her stride. Elias called out to her, his voice shaking slightly, and when she paused with a hint of annoyance, he didn't beg. He stood up, smiled genuinely, and extended a vibrant yellow wildflower toward her, thanking her for her kindness and wishing her a beautiful day. The woman's defensive posture melted instantly. Surprise washed over her face, followed by a warm, radiant smile. She took the flower, thanked him, and walked away with a noticeable spring in her step. Elias felt a strange, alien sensation in his chest, dignity. He repeated this throughout the day. He stopped asking. Instead, he waited for someone to drop a coin, and the moment they did, he executed a transaction. He exchanged their money for a flower and a blessing. The results were immediate and staggering. People who usually ignored him stopped to talk. Some who received a flower went to the coffee shop nearby and returned with a hot meal for him. By the end of the week, Elias noticed a mathematical certainty: when he had flowers, his cup overflowed. When he ran out and reverted to merely asking, the flow of money stopped. People did not want to fund his misery, they were more than happy to purchase a fleeting moment of joy. He was no longer begging. He was trading. This is where most fairy tales end, but reality is rarely so accommodating. 2 months later, the brutal hammer of winter fell upon the city. Frost coated the concrete, and the resilient wildflowers along the tracks shriveled and died under the ice. Elias woke up one morning to find his source of inventory entirely eradicated. Silas, the other beggar, laughed bitterly, telling Elias that the world didn't want him to succeed and that the cold didn't care about his little business. For a moment, the old despair threatened to swallow Elias whole. The victim mindset clawed at the edges of his consciousness. But his internal architecture had fundamentally changed. He was no longer a beggar in his own mind, he was a merchant facing a supply chain crisis. He took the small amount of cash he had hoarded over the past weeks and walked out of the station. He didn't go to a liquor store or a diner. He walked 2 miles in the freezing sleet to a discount craft store. He bought stacks of brightly colored origami paper and a cheap instruction manual. For the next 3 days, Elias sat in the warmest corner of the station, his cold, stiff fingers clumsily folding paper. He ruined dozens of sheets. He grew frustrated. But he kept folding. By the 4th day, he had a basket full of intricate, beautiful paper lotuses and cranes. He took a pen and wrote a unique, uplifting quote on the wing of each crane or the petal of each lotus. When he returned to his post, he didn't just offer an item, he offered art. The commuters, burdened by the dreary, dark winter, were captivated by the bright paper creations. His income didn't just return to its previous level, it tripled. He began taking custom requests. He used his profits to buy cheap wholesale roses from a local florist, creating mixed bouquets of real and paper flowers. He moved away from his cardboard mat. He bought clean clothes. He secured a small, cheap room in a boarding house. He was no longer waiting for salvation, he was actively constructing it. 18 months passed. The bustling railway station remained the same, a ceaseless river of humanity flowing through its grand arches. On a bright spring afternoon, two men stood near a newly installed, flourishing floral kiosk in the center of the main terminal. The kiosk was vibrant, smelling of fresh lilies and eucalyptus. The owner of the kiosk, dressed in a sharp, modest suit, was arranging a display when he noticed a familiar face walking through the crowd. It was the executive with the tailored charcoal overcoat and the leather briefcase. The florist stepped out from behind his counter, holding out a pristine white rose, and excused himself to get the man's attention. The businessman stopped, looking at the florist with polite confusion, asking if they knew each other. Elias smiled, his eyes shining with profound gratitude, and explained that nearly 2 years ago, he was sitting on a piece of cardboard near the south exit asking for spare change. He reminded the executive that instead of money, he had given him the law of exchange, telling him that if he had nothing to offer, he had no right to ask. The businessman's eyes widened in shock as he studied the clean-shaven, confident entrepreneur standing before him. He remembered the beggar. He looked at the thriving kiosk, then back to Elias, a slow, deeply impressed smile spreading across his face as he noted that Elias hadn't just listened, but understood. Elias nodded, explaining his realization that the coins people throw at beggars are just an apology for ignoring them, but the money people pay to a merchant is a symbol of respect. He shared his journey from wild weeds to folded paper during the winter, and finally to real inventory and 3 kiosks in the city. Elias handed the white rose to the man, stating that he owed him a great debt, not for money to survive a day, but for the mirror he needed to see his own worth. The businessman took the rose and shook Elias's hand firmly, not as an act of charity, but as an interaction between two equals. The trajectory of human existence is invariably steered by the lens through which a person views themselves. If you wake up every morning and violently whisper to your own subconscious that you are broken, a victim, lacking resources, and having nothing to offer, your brain will dutifully work to make that your physical reality. You will become a self-fulfilling prophecy of lack. But the moment you shift your perspective, the universe shifts with you. Every single human being currently breathing has something of immense value to give. It does not have to be capital. It can be undivided attention, a unique idea, an hour of labor, a specialized skill, an act of creativity, or even a simple expression of gratitude that brightens another person's dark day. Wealth, in its truest, most foundational form, is not the accumulation of currency. It is the continuous, joyful generation of value. When you transform your internal thoughts from a state of extracting to a state of offering, your future alters its course entirely. You must recognize your inherent value, step out of the margins of your own life, and begin the great exchange.